bombed, burned, betrayed. Gaza bleeds again. Headlines scream, rockets roar, and families run for shelter as history repeats with brutal force. A land no bigger than a city suddenly shakes the whole world. For 3,000 years, Gaza has been crushed, rebuilt, and crushed again. Pharaohs, Assyrians, Romans, Crusaders, every empire has trampled its walls. And today, Hamas rules with an iron fist. Israel strikes with fire, and millions are trapped between rubble and despair. But beneath the dust lies something deeper prophecy that declared this fate long before our time. What if every explosion we watch is not a coincidence, but a warning echoing from ancient voices? What if the ruin, the ashes, the death of its leaders were all written centuries ago? Picture Gaza's story, not as random chaos, but as destiny, marching toward a shocking, inevitable end. Stay with us as we unseal the prophecies, connect them to today's headlines, and reveal the chilling truth of Gaza's biblical destiny. Before we begin, tell us in the comments if you believe prophecy is unfolding today. Then don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. The biblical destiny of Gaza. Was the Gaza and Israel prophecy fulfilled today? Was the biblical destiny of Gaza, the Gaza and Israel prophecy, fulfilled today? It begins with a name so old it feels carved into bedrock. Gaza Azza in Hebrew. Strong fortress, a city of might, has worn that meaning like armor for millennia. Does a name shape a city's fate? Or does the city grow into the name it was given? From the start, Gaza was no backwater. It sat like a hinge between worlds, a stone gate on the land bridge that funnels caravans from Egypt toward the valleys of Mesopotamia. Control the gate, and you tax the spice, the copper, the incense, and the armies. Can you picture the dust of 1,000 hooves rising where two continents shake hands? Archaeologists push its memory back to the 3rd millennium before Christ, long before our maps were drawn. Egyptian inscriptions list it among the places tamed by Pharaoh Thutmose III in the 15th century BC as he pressed north into Canaan, a reminder that empires have always eyed this shoreline. Then come the Amarna letters of the 14th century BC, clay, pleas from Canaanite rulers begging Egypt for help against rebels and invaders. If you held one of those tablets in your palm, could you feel the anxiety baked into its clay? Even then, Gaza was a crossroads, a prize, a pressure point. By the 12th century BC, new sails dotted the coast, and a new people took root. The Philistines arrived and stitched together 5 coastal powerhouses, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, Ekron, and Gaza, what Scripture calls the lords of the Philistines. 1 Samuel 6:17. From those ports, they fortified temples, sharpened iron, and launched raids inland. Which banner would you have seen from Gaza's walls? At dawn, a caravan's pennant, or a war standard, Gaza became both market and fortress sanctuary, and staging ground, a city that could sell you purple cloth by day and send chariots by night. And then there is the scene that branded itself into Israel's memory: Samson, judge of Israel, seized in Gaza, his strength shorn, his eyes put out, displayed for mockery in a pagan hall. Judges 16:21. Can you stand in that crowd without flinching? Hear the laughter, feel the pillars, sense the tension of a story not yet finished. That moment turned Gaza into a symbol of enmity, a city standing opposite God's people, daring them at their weakest. The prophets remembered the coastline too. Amos thundered against Gaza's violence. Amos 1:6-7. Zephaniah foresaw its desolation. Zephaniah 2:4. And yet the words do more than curse. They whisper that no fortress is beyond the reach of judgment or mercy. Which verse would you reach for if you had to describe Gaza in one line? Scholars have long noticed what soldiers and traders knew. William F. Albright, one of the fathers of biblical archaeology, called Gaza the strategic key of the Philistine plain, the lock on Canaan, facing Egypt. The ancient geographer Strabo went wider, naming it the gateway to Asia, because whoever owned Gaza didn't just toll trade. They raised armies that marched from one world to another. If you stood on the ramparts and looked south to the Nile and east to the Euphrates, would you feel the tug of those horizons, the pull of kingdoms like tides? Yet here the name fortress fractures into paradox. Gaza, the strong, could never rest. Its walls rose and fell like a chest under siege. Egyptian campaigns, Assyrian, iron, Babylonian, fires, Persian governors, Greek phalanxes, Roman legions, Crusader banners, Ottoman scimitars. Count them if you can. How many times can a gate be battered and rebuilt and still be called secure? History in Gaza is written in layers of ash and limestone. War collapse, reconstruction, again and again, a city both coveted and cursed. Have you ever lived in a season like that, strong on paper, but beset on every side, rebuilt by morning and shaken by night? Isn't it strange that a name forged to mean strength has become shorthand for wreckage and grief? The city whose very syllables whispered fortress now evokes collapse. How does a place built to project might turn into a symbol of sorrow. The answer does not hide in maps or military manuals. It lives in prophecy. From its earliest pages, the Bible paints Gaza as a stage where judgment would one day thunder. Walls would not hold, palaces would not last, because the God of Israel had spoken of an end. Does that unsettle you? How a decree can outlast dynasties and redraw the fate of stone. Yet in Philistine days, Gaza's power was more than spears on a rampart. It's true, leverage pulsed along a road older than empires, the Via Maris, the coastal artery, stitching Egypt to Mesopotamia. Picture the caravans, cinnamon and cassia, breathing through woven sacks, copper, gleaming under linen, wheat, swaying in wicker-dyed textiles, folded like captured sunsets. Whoever gripped Gaza set a hand on the valve of the ancient world's wealth. Can you hear the bargaining at the gate? The stamp of camels, the clatter of scales, the murmured prayers before a risky crossing. Archaeologist Trud Dothan, who gave the Philistines back their texture and color, noted how the Pentapolis and Gaza especially grew fat on both sea and sand. A modest harbor opened doors to Cyprus, to Crete, to the Nile's broad mouth. Sherds of Mycenaean pottery, foreign metalwork, and imported luxuries whisper that Gaza plugged into an international economy long before Israel's kings took their thrones. If you handled one of those shards still smelling faintly of salt and thyme, would you feel how far the city's fingers reached? Culture there did not run in a single channel. Canaanite rites braided with Egyptian styles. Aegean patterns crossed the threshold and stayed. The Philistines borrowed freely, yet kept a hard core of steel, a martial identity that neither feasts nor trade diluted. Walls and palaces did more than defend. They flashed status. Excavations have turned up oversized storage jars, rippled with marine motifs, delicate figurines of gods, buttressed structures and gates that show an architectural confidence ahead of the curve. Can you imagine standing in a courtyard faced with limestone, tasting sea wind on your tongue and thinking, "This will last"? But the smoke that climbed from Gaza's altars did not rise to the God of Israel. Dagon stood there, and Astarte and Baal. Inscriptions and artifacts speak of sacrifices and fertility rites, rhythms at odds with the holiness Yahweh demanded. Is it any wonder the prophets lifted their voices? Amos cried against Gaza's cruelty because they carried into exile whole communities. I will send fire on the wall of Gaza. Amos 1:6-7. Zephaniah foresaw the coastline's shame. Gaza shall be deserted. Zephaniah 2-4. Jeremiah groaned before Pharaoh's strike. Jeremiah 47:1. And Zechariah warned that Gaza would writhe. Zechariah 9:5. Which of those lines lodges in you like a stone in the shoe? Even Greek eyes saw its sheen. In the 5th century BC, Herodotus could point to Gaza as prosperous and formidable. For travelers and traders alike, it read as abundance. Warehouses, full streets, alive, coins changing hands. But prosperity without justice is a glittering snare. The prophets did not only weigh Gaza's violence, they indicted its commerce when it became commerce in souls. You sold the people of Judah and the people of Jerusalem. Joel 3:6. The charge echoes across the plain of Philistia. Does that make you look differently at the ledgers and contracts? How can you gain drip? So Gaza was never merely a bastion. It was a bazaar, a campus of gods, a crossroads where tongues mixed and ideas traveled, a place where caravans crossed paths under high walls, while priests stoked altars with offerings that smelled of grain and blood. Wealth circled through the city like a tide, but its rhythm moved to the drum of idolatry. Do you feel the dissonance? A marketplace humming with profit, while the cry for righteousness went unanswered. And because of that fracture splendor seated beside brutality, the end was sown in the beginning. Scripture frames the paradox without flinching. A city named for strength becomes a byword for ruin, not because masonry is weak, but because injustice hollows even the thickest stones. You can pile treasure to the ceiling. You can measure walls in cubits. You can carve lions over the gates. When the Lord decrees judgment, who can brace the door? When a prophet points at a fortress and names it fleeting, how many battlements make a difference? Imagine you are a merchant arriving at dusk after days on the road. Would you look at the torches lining the gate and think only of safety? Or would a line from Amos tug at the edge of your mind? Imagine you are a scribe tallying imports from Cyprus, copies of contracts at your elbow. Would the ink feel heavy when you remember the rumor that whole communities were once traded like goods? Imagine you are a pilgrim passing the temple. Precinct incense in the air song in a language not your own. Would you sense the fault running under the marble, a prophecy waiting for its hour? All of Gaza's brilliance, the trade routes, the ports, thin ribbon to the islands, the artisan's hand on clay, the mix of fashions and gods was real. None of it is erased by the oracles. In a way, all of it makes the oracles more piercing. If a place can be this wealthy, this connected, this advanced in design, and still be measured and found wanting, what does that say about the scales heaven uses? What would you write in the margins if you were copying Zephaniah by lamplight? A protest, a prayer, or a question? How long? The paradox stands, and it stares back at us. A name that meant fortress grew to stand for collapse. A city presented as an emporium of power became in Scripture's lexicon a land appointed for desolation. Geography gave Gaza leverage. Trade gave it luster. Culture gave it layers. But prophecy gave it a verdict. And when verdicts are spoken by the one who judges nations, neither high wall nor heavy treasury can argue the sentence down. Gaza, whose very name once promised strength, was not left to vague warnings or poetic omens. The prophets aimed straight at it, naming deeds and nailing down consequences. God did not thunder in abstractions. He raised specific voices to indict specific crimes and to announce a sentence that fit the stain. Can you feel the weight of that clarity? No evasions, no loopholes, just a ledger of wrongs and the verdict they summon. Listen to the drumbeat in Amos, a cadence that signals guilt, piling upon guilt. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they carried away a whole people captive to deliver them up to Edom. So I will send a fire upon the wall of Gaza, and it shall devour her strongholds. Amos 1:6-7. Place yourself in the marketplace when those words first rang out in the 8th century BC, when Gaza's warehouses were full and its streets clattered with trade. Would you have kept haggling, or would your hand have frozen over the scales? The charge was not a rumor of war, but a crime against persons. Villages emptied, families seized whole communities, reduced to coin, marched south, and sold off to Edom like cargo. Gaza's prosperity was not merely commerce. It was commerce in lives. If you had watched a caravan roll out under guard mothers, sons, the elderly, would the dust in your throat have tasted different. Scripture's accusation is surgical. The city turned people into profit, and the God who hears the cry of the oppressed. Exodus 3:7 would not look away. Do not be deceived, for whatever one sows, that will he also reap. Galatians 6:7. Does that line feel theoretical here, or uncomfortably literal? Amos's images hit where Gaza boasted most. Fire on the wall. The symbol of security, of we are safe behind this, and palaces consumed the very rooms where unjust policies were written and sealed. Judgment starts at the places that most promised protection and power. What is a wall worth when the charge against it is written in blood? What is a palace worth if the throne beneath its canopy has approved the sale of souls? The violence meted out in the market would meet its mirror in the gate as they tore communities apart, so their own defenses would be torn open. Can you hear the echo in Amos's cadence, the justice that returns in kind? Nor was Amos alone. Zephaniah sharpened the map so no city could slip between the lines. For Gaza shall be forsaken, and Ashkelon a desolation. Ashdod at noonday shall be plundered, and Ekron shall be uprooted. Zephaniah 2:4. At noonday, as if to say, the blow would not bother with the cover of night. Imagine standing on the ramparts under the brightest sun, convinced that danger comes at dusk, and then feeling the shock of a judgment that walks straight up at noon. What would you clutch in that moment? A spear, a contract, a prayer. Notice how each sentence of prophecy binds cause to consequence. God is not capricious. He is precise. Gaza's sin was not merely that it fought wars. It trafficked in entire populations, converting image bearers into inventory. The verdict answers the crime walls that underwrote the trade, would burn palaces that curated the luxury bought by suffering, would fall to ash. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? Genesis 18:25. A century after Amos struck the first blow, Zephaniah sharpened the sentence and added a darker chord abandonment. Not a poetic melancholy, but a legal verdict, left ownerless, unprotected. The Hebrew term Zephaniah employs carries the chill of being forsaken. A place no patron claims, no garrison guards, no builder bothers to restore. Zephaniah 2:4. Can you picture it? Streets where caravans once shouted prices now swallow their own echoes. A city so emptied that even the wind forgets to pass through. If you walked through those gates at dusk, would you call out and expect anyone to answer? Zephaniah ties this desolation to a sin that hides in plain sight: pride. Gaza had learned to boast in its coordinates. It sat astride the trade veins and forged treaties with the mighty. It believed geography guaranteed tomorrow. Some trust in chariots, and some in horses, sang Israel. Psalm 27. But Gaza trusted in walls and agreements, in the math of roots and the ink of alliances. Have you ever leaned on your own fortifications, savings, contacts, clever plans, and felt invincible for a moment? The prophet announces that this very confidence would crack. The city that once pulsed with traffic would be stilled. Without army, without commerce, without splendor, silence would succeed the marketplace. What happens to a gate when no one is coming? Notice how Scripture refuses abstraction. Each sin receives a mirror-made penalty. Amos had named the commerce of souls, entire villages lifted like cargo, and handed to Edom. Amos 1:6-7. The answer: I will send a fire upon the wall of Gaza, and it shall devour her strongholds. Fire where they felt safest. Palaces, the rooms where unjust edicts were sealed, were reduced to ash. Does justice feel theoretical in that light, or terrifyingly precise? Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Proverbs 16:18. is no proverb on a plaque here. It is a timetable. Zephaniah then addresses the deeper calculus arrogance dressed as strategy. Gaza took a gift, its corridor of nations, and turned it into leverage without reverence. Instead of using a privileged position to shelter the vulnerable, it fattened itself on advantage. Instead of trusting God, it traded trust for treaties. Cursed is the man who trusts in man, whose heart turns away from the Lord. Jeremiah 17:5. Do those words land like an accusation from afar, or like a hand tapping your own ledger? If you had been a magistrate weighing new pacts, would you have still believed that paper could out-argue prophecy? Therefore, the sentences rhyme with the crimes: slave raiding and human trafficking, fire and collapse, walls and palaces torn down to their foundations, pride in position and alliances, abandonment, desolation, total emptiness, forsaken at noon, not even granted the mercy of darkness. Zephaniah 2:4. Imagine standing on the ramparts under the brightest sun when the life of a city suddenly steps away. What would you cling to then? A spear, a treaty, or a prayer? Gaza became a parable. The prophets could point to social corruption twined with political arrogance, prosperity divorced from righteousness. The indictment is not that it was strong, but that it baptized injustice with strength, monetized blessing, and mortared its walls with trust in everything but God. So the conclusion follows with the inevitability of a falling stone. The same voices that named the sins declared. The outcomes: walls burned, land emptied, a city left to the silence it preferred over the cry of the oppressed. After Amos and Zephaniah, another voice entered the story and pressed deeper into Gaza's fate: the prophet Zechariah. He did not stop at shattered gates and fallen towers. He named a grief that seeps beneath rubble, a spiritual bewilderment, a hope collapsing from the inside out. Listen to his words. Gaza also will see it, and will be greatly grieved, and Ekron, because its hope will be ashamed, and the king of Gaza will perish, and Ashkelon will not be inhabited, and I will take away the blood from their mouth, and their abominations from between their teeth, and a remnant shall be left for our God, and he shall be as a prince in Judah, and Ekron shall be like the Jebusites. Zechariah 9:5-7. Can you hear the shift from broken walls to broken expectations, from siegecraft to the soul? Zechariah announces that Gaza will be greatly grieved. Not only the pain that war carves in streets and stones, but the ache that comes when the thing that carried a people their confidence, its narrative of safety, suddenly fails. Its hope will be ashamed. What does that look like on an ordinary morning? Imagine treaties that once seemed unbreakable turning brittle in a single hour. Imagine looking to a throne for steadiness and finding the dais empty. The king of Gaza will perish. If you lived within those walls, which would you reach for first when trust gave way? Underfoot, a weapon, a contract, or a prayer? He traces the unraveling point by point. Political power unseats kings, disappear. Civic life thins. Ashkelon will not be inhabited. Regional certainty flickers. Ekron's identity bends like the Jebusites, redefined and absorbed. Everything that once stitched the city's story together, crowns, covenants, familiar borders, loosens and drifts. Have you ever felt that kind of dizziness when what you leaned on yesterday no longer holds today? Then the oracle moves from palace to altar, from banners to the very mouth. I will take away the blood from their mouth and their abominations from between their teeth. The picture is intimate, almost unsettling worship, close enough to taste. In Gaza, idolatrous rites included blood sacrifices and foods dedicated to pagan deities. These practices formed habits, identity, and daily rhythm. God declares an end to them. What happens when the flavor of a people's faith is suddenly removed? If the table that shaped you is cleared in a moment, who are you? When you rise, Zechariah shows that judgment does not stop at architecture. It not only topples walls and darkens palaces, it reaches the spiritual center and pulls up what corrupted it. Gaza had placed its trust in leaders who could perish in covenants, that could break in gods that could be uprooted, and in military might that could be shaken. Prophecy reveals that every one of those supports will tremble at once, leaving the city without direction, without guidance, without a future to claim as its own. Could there be a more complete exposure of false security? Zechariah adds a detail that startles the ear. In the very heart of judgment, there would be a remnant for God. Not a poetic flourish, but a promise. A remnant shall be left for our God, and he shall be as a prince in Judah. Zechariah 9:7. Can you picture that a small company inside Gaza turning away from the practices that once defined the city, choosing the Lord in the shadow of ruin? This is grace walking through rubble. It means Gaza would not be wiped from memory like chalk in the rain. Instead, a rescued few would be gathered and woven into God's story, dignified with belonging as a prince in Judah. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to be part of that remnant, small, perhaps frightened, but suddenly claimed? Zechariah's voice sits beside Amos and Zephaniah, yet drills even deeper. He does not only speak about broken stones, he addresses broken hearts, inner pain, spiritual confusion, the collapse of confidence from the inside out. Gaza also will see it and be greatly grieved. and Ekron, because its hope will be ashamed. And the king of Gaza will perish, and Ashkelon will not be inhabited. Zechariah 9:5-6. Their hope will be ashamed is more than disappointment. It's the unraveling of what sustained the city. Leaders gone, alliances, failed the very story they told themselves, now hollow. If you were standing under those walls, what would you reach for when the old supports gave way? A spear, a treaty, or a prayer? He ties the spiritual to the political with a surgeon's care. Gaza had lived by idols, by violence, and by confidence in human rulers. The result would be pain, confusion, and the loss of power. The king will perish, political center removed. Ashkelon, not be inhabited, cities emptied. Ekron, like the Jebusites, identities redefined. And then the intimate cut, I will take away the blood from their mouth, and their abominations from between their teeth. Zechariah 9:7. The Philistine writes, blood sacrifices and foods set apart for their gods had shaped daily life. God announces He will uproot these practices. Judgment will not stop at the gate. It will reach the table and the tongue. Have you ever felt the Lord press His hand on something you assumed was normal and say, no more? This is what it looks like when holy fire touches both palaces and palates. The pattern is exact. Idols, uprooted leaders, eliminated, pride shattered. Yet in the middle of that collapse, a thread of mercy remains the remnant. Scripture often whispers this in the ruins, Isaiah 1:9, Romans 9:27. After the shaking, some will still belong to God. That is not a loophole. It is sovereignty and kindness sharing the same sentence. If you were one of those few, would you feel small or royal when you heard as a prince in Judah? Would you want to hide or to start again? Now the year turns to 332 BC. A young Macedonian Alexander moves with a will that feels unstoppable. His aim is simple to say and hard to resist. Lock down the Mediterranean corridor and cut a road to Egypt. Between him and that ambition rises a city like a wall that refuses to let him pass Gaza. This is no soft target. The city sits on a hill with thick, high fortifications and towers that look for miles. From those parapets, the defenders could read an army's intent by the dust it raised. Inside, the Persian governor, Batis, understands what surrender would mean and chooses to resist. If you were in his place, would you open the gate to live with shame, or hold the line and risk everything? Alexander orders a full siege. For 2 long months, the ground groans. Macedonian engineers trace trenches like veins around the city, heap earthen ramps until they bite the skyline and drag monstrous towers within bowshot of the battlements. Day after day, Catapults sling stones that crash into gates and shiver walls. Night after night, defenders patch prey and plan the next morning's answer. Inside the city, men stack missiles. Women grind grain. Children carry water. All prepare to resist to the last breath. Can you hear the cadence, the thud of rams, the crack of timbers, the shout from tower to tower? At last, the defenses give way. A breach yawns. The Macedonian phalanx pours through like iron water. What follows is a bloodbath, thousands cut down in the streets, the survivors bound for sale. The city that had boasted it could hold the road is reduced to rubble and silence. And the fate of Batis sears itself into the record. Refusing to kneel, he is seized and dragged alive, tied to a chariot, circling the broken walls, a warning carved in dust and flesh. If you had watched that procession, would you have turned your face away, or would you have stared, unable to forget? The message could not be missed. No city that defied the conqueror would remain standing. With Gaza broken, Alexander secured his passage to Egypt and locked down the region. For the victors, it was strategy fulfilled. For Gaza, it was a mark that would not fade, destroyed, plundered, subjugated. From that point forward, the city became a symbol in its own story. No matter how many times the walls were raised, again, new empires would test them, and again, they would fall. After Alexander's siege, Gaza did what Gaza has always done. It rose from rubble and tried again. Empire after empire claimed it as their own. Because the map had not moved, the city still sat like a hinge between Africa and Asia. A gate armies had to knock on, and caravans had to pass. In 63 BC, the Roman general, Pompey, marched in, took Gaza for Rome, and folded it into imperial rule. The Romans did what they knew best, rebuilt. Temples, rose a theater curved toward the sky. A central market rang with bartering. The old shimmer returned like a mirage taking shape. Caravans threaded in from Egypt, Arabia and Syria, bells chiming, wheels creaking, languages crossing in the shade of colonnades. The Jewish historian Josephus catalogues it in his Antiquities, a city alive to maritime and overland trade. Strabo, writing near the time of Christ, points to Gaza as a knot that ties roots together. Can you see yourself stepping off a camel at dusk, the sea breeze in your face, wondering whether this time the city's glory might finally hold? But brilliance never meant calm. In AD 66, when Judea rose against Rome, Jewish bands struck Gaza, one more flash of the political and religious tension that seemed woven into the stones. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? Psalm 2:1. If you had lived behind those Roman walls, would the question have sounded like poetry or like the news? Then came a slower earthquake. not a legion's trumpet, but a change in worship. As the Roman Empire turned toward Christianity, Gaza entered a long, bruising transition. Up to the 4th century, the city was known as a bastion of paganism. Temples honored Mars, Aphrodite, Apollo, and Zeus. The populace resisted the new faith with stubborn pride. Enter Bishop Porphyry of Gaza, AD 347-420, a pastor with a spine of cedar. According to Sozomen's ecclesiastical history, Porphyry sought help from Emperor Arcadius. With the support of Empress Eudoxia, imperial decrees arrived. The pagan temples were torn down, and a great church rose in their place. Imagine the smoke of sacrifices thinning the clatter of idols removed the first psalms echoing where hymns to other gods had stood. Was this victory or loss? Cleansing or erasure? You turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God. Thessalonians chapter 1:9 reads one line of scripture. Yet even that turning can feel like a storm. If you were a merchant whose family had offered at Apollo's precinct for generations, how would you have answered when the hammers started? The transformation marked the triumph of Christianity in Gaza and the violent disappearance of its ancient religiosity. Streets that had known processions to Mars now watched bishops process with candles. Altars became aisles. Some rejoiced, others mourned. In your own bones, would you have named it renewal? Or would you have felt unmoored, a citizen of a city changing its soul? History turned another page in AD 637. During the caliphate of Umar ibn al-Khattab, Muslim forces took Gaza, and the city learned a new prayer and a new rhythm. In Islam, Gaza gathered special honor because Hashim ibn Abd Manaf, the Prophet Muhammad's great-grandfather, died and was buried there. From then on, the city bore a new epithet, Gazat Hashim Gaza, of Hashim, a name that braided faith and memory into its identity. Empires shifted creeds, crossed, but Gaza remained what geography had made it a gate. The coastlands shall wait for his law. Isaiah 42:4. Do lines like that make you wonder how many tides a shoreline can bear? So the pattern continued, rebuilt and renamed, refitted and repurposed. Gaza kept being claimed by the powers who needed that corridor. Josephus wrote it, Strabo mapped it, bishops prayed within it, caliphs governed over it. Through the long dusk of the Middle Ages, Gaza passed from grip to grip, like a contested standard. In the 12th century, the Crusaders took it and laced it with fortifications. Then, in 1187, after the horns of Hattan had sounded defeat, Saladin swept back, as Ibn al-Athir records, and reclaimed the city. Under the Mamluks, and later beneath the wide cloak of the Ottomans, Gaza settled into the rank of a secondary town, important enough to watch, never free enough to rest. Every empire left fingerprints, spades turned up, Roman curves, and amphitheater's ribs in the earth. Byzantine mosaics, small stones singing in color. Islamic mosques rising in new lines of prayer. Layer over layer, age over age, the ground kept its ledger. Yet one thread ran through all the pages: instability. Gaza was almost always someone else's possession, almost always contested, almost always bruised. It rose in splendor, fell under steel, rose again, only to feel the ground tilt once more. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. Daniel 2:21. The centuries turned, and with the 20th came a fresh tremor. The map of the world was being redrawn, and this small strip of coast found itself once more in the crosshairs of history. In 1917, as the Great War tore empires apart, Gaza passed from Ottoman hands to the British Empire, folded into the British Mandate of Palestine under the League of Nations. The city was trapped between two promises: encouragement for a Jewish national home. On one side, assurances of Arab autonomy on the other. What happens when the same pen signs letters facing opposite directions? Tension thickened. Gaza, fused to the larger fate of Palestine, became a hotbed of protests, clashes, and uprisings against British rule. After the Second World War, the focus tightened. In 1947, the UN Partition Plan set the region on edge. In 1948, when Israel declared independence, the First Arab-Israeli War ignited. Roads jammed with people, houses emptied in haste. Thousands of Palestinians fled or were forced from their homes, and Gaza received wave after wave, a narrow strip straining to hold a sea of stories. From that point until 1967, the Egyptian administration held the strip. The numbers swelled. By 1950, the United Nations estimated that more than 2/3 of Gaza's population were Palestinian refugees. A territory became a vast camp. Tents multiplied, and then concrete. Hope tried to root in hard soil. Overcrowded, impoverished, always under the hum of military tension. How does a child learn the sound of peace when the sky keeps reminding them otherwise? Lamentations has a line that aches here. Judah has gone into exile because of affliction. She dwells now among the nations. Lamentations 1:3. Do words written for another century somehow fit the outline of these streets? In the thunderclap of the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel seized Gaza, along with the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. From that moment, Gaza lived nearly 4 decades beneath Israeli control. Years measured not only by calendars, but by curfews, clashes, and the steady rattle of uprisings. Streets learned the language of checkpoints. Families learned to read the sky. Does Ecclesiastes not whisper a time for war and a time for peace? Ecclesiastes 3:8. And yet, In those years, did anyone truly remember what peace sounded like? By 1987, the pressure under the surface split open. The first intifada erupted, stones skipping like sparks, crowds filling alleys, barricades blooming at intersections. In the midst of that upheaval, something new took form that would rewire Gaza's future Hamas. The name is an acronym, Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, the Islamic resistance movement, but in Arabic, it also carries the pulse of ardor, zeal. From its birth, it presented itself as more than a party. It was a religious current, a social network, and a military apparatus braided together. Inspired by Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, it fused preaching with politics, charity with command, and named its strategy, without blush, all of Palestine liberated by jihad. In 1988, Hamas issued its founding charter. The document did not mumble. It declared the destruction of the State of Israel as its purpose, refused Israel's right to exist, and rejected peace processes and negotiations. Can a charter be a drumbeat? Can a paragraph close a door for a generation? They cry, "Peace, peace," when there is no peace. Jeremiah 6:14 feels less like poetry here and more like a diagnosis. The years that followed mapped a grim arithmetic. While the Palestinian Authority pursued diplomacy with Israel, Hamas gathered strength in the shadows. Suicide bombings in buses and cafes, roadside ambushes, clandestine cells. At the same time, it built a lattice of social aid schools for the young, clinics for the sick, mosques for the devout, winning loyalty in neighborhoods where groceries were scarce and hope scarcer. Beneath that civic face, workshops fashioned weapons, arsenals swelled, and recruits drilled. If you were a parent receiving a food parcel, would the hand that offered it make you forget the metal, moving through tunnels at night? Psalm 10 sketches the paradox with ancient clarity. He lurks in ambush. He seizes the poor when he draws him into his net. Psalm 10:9. In 2005, Israel pulled its soldiers and settlements out of the Gaza Strip in a unilateral withdrawal. Many dared to breathe differently. Might a door finally open? But hope proved fragile. In 2007, after bloody street battles with the Palestinian Authority, Hamas seized full control of the territory. The Strip has been ruled by the movement ever since, sealed by international blockades, lashed by exchanges of fire, an enclave where sirens are part of the weather. They have made ready their hearts for war. The psalmist once wrote Psalm 57:7, paraphrase. Last year, the conflict crossed another threshold. In a surprise assault, Hamas militants breached the border, killed civilians, and abducted dozens of Israelis, women and children among them. Hostages vanished into Gaza's underworld tunnels, threaded like capillaries. Safe houses tucked behind ordinary doors, bodies turned into bargaining chips. lives raised as shields. Imagine waiting by a phone that will not ring, a table with a chair that stays empty. How long, O Lord? Psalm 13:1 becomes less a verse and more a breath. Israel answered with a campaign unlike those before airstrikes that hammered launch sites and command rooms, armored columns, rolling into dense neighborhoods, surgical strikes aimed at the movement's leadership. Names in headlines became coordinates. Yahya Sinwar, long seen as Gaza's strongman. Marwan Issa, a military architect. Ismail Haniyeh, Hamas's political leader, assassinated in Tehran. Every strike promised to blunt the blade. Every strike seemed to carve fresh wounds. Violence called to violence, and civilians, families, who had learned too many routes to too few shelters, were caught between. Isaiah's lament fits the shape of the moment. Their feet run to evil. The way of peace they do not know, Isaiah 59:7-8. Today, Hamas governs Gaza with a clenched hand. It is simultaneously a political authority and a fighting force. It oversees security services, administers local ministries, regulates daily life, and chooses when the rockets are silent and when they scream. Its armed wing, the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades, fields thousands of fighters, stores, munitions, and moves through a vast web of underground tunnels that make the earth itself a second city. The Palestinian Authority's writ holds in parts of the West Bank, but not here. In Gaza, there is only one command that counts. Despite losses in airstrikes and raids, the movement's leaders continue to set the enclave's course, rejecting peace agreements and keeping confrontation as policy. Today, analysts still reach for the same bleak phrase to describe Gaza, the world's largest open-air prison. More than 2 million souls are pressed into roughly 365 square kilometers, a strip so narrow that the sea and the fence feel like opposite walls of the same room. Power blinks on for a few hours and then dies. Taps cough brackish water. Work is a rumor many never catch. Children learn to name aircraft by their sound and to play among ruins that their parents remember as streets. To some, Gaza is a banner of resistance against Israel. To others, it is a crucible of terrorism. But if you step past slogans and step into doorways, what you meet is a wounded people caught between Hamas's iron grip, Israel's strikes and incursions, and the cool indifference of distant powers who write statements and redraw maps, but do not bury the dead. Once again, the pattern holds. Gaza remains what it has so often been, a contested gate, ruled with pride and force, circling the same road of pain as if bound to it. We have walked through history and listened to the prophets. Now the question, rises like heat off the stones. What will be the end of Gaza? From its earliest mentions, this narrow coast was a stronghold for the Philistines, who raided Israel again and again. And today, the Strip remains a launch point where Hamas fires rockets, sends raiders, and kidnaps Israelis. Across centuries, Gaza has repeatedly stood as an adversary to the people of God. Hear Amos, who raised his voice against Gaza's crimes. I will send a fire upon the wall of Gaza, and it shall devour her palaces. Amos 1:7. The charge was not vague, because they carried into exile a whole people, to deliver them up to Edom. Amos 6. Entire communities, villages emptied, families chained, were traded like cargo. Gaza enriched itself by turning image bearers into merchandise. Before the judge of all the earth, such a ledger deserves fire and ruin. Now consider the mirror we have watched from. In 2023, Hamas militants crossed the border, murdered civilians, and seized dozens of hostages, women and children among them. They were carried into Gaza, hidden in tunnels and safe houses held as bargaining chips and human shields. If the city once sold slaves today, it cages captives. In heaven's calculus, is it not the same sin with a different face, treating lives as inventory? Woe to those who devise iniquity. They covet fields and seize them. Micah 2:2. When the currency becomes human, what coin can cleanse the hand? Amos named the judgment fire on the walls palaces consumed, and last year the world watched. Flames walk the skyline. Again, bombardments hammering launch sites and command rooms, neighborhoods reduced to ash towers. Buckling tunnels collapsed the palaces of Gaza. Its seats of power and command struck again and again. Was the prophecy fulfilled there? The answer cuts two ways. On one edge, yes, partially. What Amos declared repeats as a grim pattern in history. Gaza sins, Gaza burns, walls glow, leaders fall, and people suffer. On the other edge, Scripture keeps pointing past the cycle toward a final reckoning, not measured by one more night of sirens or one more ceasefire that frays by morning. There is, the prophets insist, an end of ends. Zephaniah framed it without blur. For Gaza shall be forsaken. Zephaniah 2:4. Not a momentary abandonment, the sack of a city followed by the return of business as usual, but a total, definitive forsaking. Picture a place losing every shelter and patron, every guarantee, and garrison the fortress, becoming its opposite, empty and fragile. A name that once meant strength, now a byword for exposure. This helplessness is not only military, it is spiritual. Cursed is the man who trusts in man, whose heart turns away from the Lord. Jeremiah 17:5. A city without God's covering, without leaders who can truly guide, without a hope that holds when the wind changes. Do we taste an early echo even now? Beyond armed resistance, Gaza lives in isolation, blockaded by land, sea, and sky, caught in a loop of reprisal and want with no visible exit. International actors speak, little shifts. Families ration light and bread. Flags go up. Rubble stays. How else can we name such constriction except as the shadow of Zephaniah's word? And yet the story refuses to end mid-sentence. Are we witnessing the last fulfillment, or yet another turn of the pattern? If you were a parent standing in a queue for water, or a soldier staring across a fence of wire, what would you pray for? Justice that burns, mercy that spares, or a future you cannot yet imagine? Zechariah adds a line that chills the marrow. Gaza also will see it and will be greatly grieved, and the king of Gaza will perish. This is not a passing ache or a bruise that fades with time. It is the deep, tearing sorrow of a people whose last supports snap beneath them, of households losing what little remained to cling to. The king of Gaza will perish. The phrase points like an arrow to leadership undone. In antiquity, rulers fell beneath foreign banners. Crowns rolled in dust when empires shifted. In our own era, we have watched Hamas leaders fall in airstrikes and covert operations, names announced funerals, hushed command chains, frayed. Each time a leader is removed, the oracle seems to flicker into the present. Gaza left without a steady voice, without a hand firm enough to calm the waters, without a head that can hold the body together. Yet Zechariah does not stop at momentary vacancies. He lifts the horizon higher a day when leadership is not merely bruised, but broken entirely. When Gaza's power and human hopes fail all at once. Pride is stripped, walls reduced to ash, voices that once commanded silenced in the wind. What happens to a city when the throne room is empty and no one knows which way to face the king? Will perish. He says, not one man only, but the idea of rule itself collapsing under the weight of God's final verdict. We have walked the corridors of history and listened to the cadence of the prophets. We have watched Gaza fall and rise and fall again. But the picture expands beyond one coastline. The true end of Gaza is woven into a larger tapestry, the day of the Lord, the judgment of the nations. Joel opens the final page with unflinching clarity. For behold, in those days, and at that time when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. And there I will enter into judgment with them on account of my people and my heritage. Israel. Joel 3:2. Judgment, then, is not provincial or parochial. It is not simply Gaza against Israel or Hamas against Jerusalem. It is global, all nations, drawn into a reckoning, not decided in parliaments, but summoned by providence. In that procession, Gaza stands at the front line. From earliest times, the city was a staging ground for strikes against Israel, a depot for the sale of captives, a place where violence and commerce clasped hands. In the 21st century, it still plays a similar role: launch site, tunnel mouth, enclave of hostility. Is it any wonder, then, that its name is written near the edge of the final map? Its posture across centuries, opposition, oppression, rebellion, has trained it for that grim place in the line. Does that thought land as inevitability or as a warning? Zechariah complements Joel's vision with a darker contour. I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem. The city shall be taken, the houses plundered, the women violated, and half of the city shall go into captivity, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Zechariah 14:2. Here is a global uprising, a world leaning hard against Zion. Gaza, pressed against that fevered border, does not stand apart. It is absorbed into the surge. What we witness now, missiles arcing, raids in darkness, kidnappings that empty chairs at family tables, retaliatory bombardments that redraw neighborhoods, is only a shadow on the wall of a greater storm. The apocalypse takes the thought to its terminus. And he gathered them together to the place called in Hebrew Armageddon, Revelation 16:16. On that day, the nations do not march by wise deliberation, but under a net of deception, spirits of demons, to assemble them for battle. Revelation 16:14. The lines harden. The purpose clarifies, not merely against a city, but against God. Gaza, long a symbol of hostility toward Israel, is swept into the larger tide, a local emblem inside a universal revolt. What began with Philistine raids, what morphed into charters and rockets, what splashes across today's headlines, rises to its peak in an eschatological war. When that hour arrives, the words of the prophets will not feel like metaphors. They will be fulfilled to the letter, no partial echo, no temporary abandonment, but the final sentence read aloud. This is not another round of conflict, not a ceasefire that frays at dawn. It is the last judgment, for Gaza shall be forsaken. Zephaniah 2:4. The prophet said, and in that finale, Gaza will not rise again. Its ruins will cease to be projects for masons, and will instead stand as testimony stone sermons that outlast the voices that once shouted in its markets, "The Lord judges the nations that set themselves against his people." Gaza, then, is not merely a case study in geopolitics. it is a solemn warning. What looks like a territorial dispute is at its root a spiritual stage. Behind every barrage and every kidnapping, behind every siren and every funeral, there moves a larger rebellion, the uprising of nations against the plan of God. Zechariah's grief, Joel's valley, Revelation's gathering, they braid into a single cord that tightens as history thins. And yet the prophet's precision does not invite gloating. It invites trembling. If leadership can perish, if walls can burn, if coalitions can be drawn by lies toward a field they do not understand, what hope remains for any city that stakes its future on pride or steel? The Lord is a refuge for his people, a stronghold for the people of Israel. Joel 3:16. That promise is not a license to hate. It is a call to choose where you will stand when the ground shakes under banners that will burn or beneath a word that will not. Hold the scene where the scriptures leave it. A broken people, grieving leaders, cut off a city, stripped, the world tilting toward a valley where God himself will judge. What we see in today's headlines, missiles, assassinations, reprisals, remains a prelude, an echo, a shadow of the greater day approaching. Every war, every ruin, every fallen ruler hints at the larger fulfillment drawing near, and the end of Gaza becomes more than a line on a map. It becomes a sign for the nations that what men call strategy heaven may call rebellion. That what empires label security, the judge may weigh and find wanting. A city that always, from a fortress on the Via Maris to a crossroads of empires, Gaza's story circles the same hinge wealth, pride collision, and flame. The prophets framed the pattern. History kept replaying it from Philistine power and the fall under Alexander to modern sieges and rulers cut down. The thread beneath the ruins is simple and terrible when people become inventory and power replaces justice walls eventually burn, and names once synonymous with strength become bywords for grief. The lesson is not geopolitical technique, but moral gravity. Geography can elevate a city, but only righteousness sustains it. The message to us is sobriety and hope turn from cycles that monetize pain, defend the dignity of every image bearer, and keep room for a remnant that chooses mercy over might. If this spoke to you, comment 7777, like the video, and subscribe for the next chapter. Thank you for watching. See you in the next episode.